Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new The Hacker Factory podcast with hacker maker Phillip Wylie. You're about to discover what the role of a professional hacker entails, the different specializations it holds, and what it takes to learn and become one. Enjoy the conversation as Phillip and guests unveil the secrets of professional hacking, a mysterious, intriguing, and often misunderstood occupation. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Hello, and welcome to the Hacker Factory podcast. I'm your host, Phillip Wylie. I'm here today with my good friend, Darin Fredde, in the actual Hacker Factory studios. Darin's local, so we're actually recording in studio today. So I'm very happy to have him. Darin and I have known each other for a long time, back in our CAD drafting days, which go back to 1995. So instead of just one old guy, this time you get two old guys. But I'm really happy to have Darin. Darin and I worked together at a company doing CAD drafting, and then we kind of split ways and both got into IT and eventually security, and our paths reconnected. So we've been really good friends for years, and it's an honor to have him join us today. Welcome, Darin.
Thanks. What an introduction. I feel old now. So I'm 53. Let's just get that out of the bag. That way nobody had to try to guess at it since no video.
Yeah, but you look young for age.
Well, thanks. So do you.
So why don't you tell our listeners about your background?
Oh, sure. Well, you mentioned some of it, so I'll skip over that for brevity. But my background is unusual like yours. Prior to knowing you, Phillip knows the story that I'll share with some of them. Is nothing was really normal for me. Kind of growing up, and I don't think I'm unique. And I think that's why it's worth mentioning, because it's not something people normally say. But I was a drug addict and kind of a loser beginning, and my journey kind of started for me personally in about *86, and then I met you later on when I was trying to rebuild my life and stuff. And CAD was really part of it was driven by a necessity. Traditional college, just wasn't cut out for it in the beginning stages. Of course, that changed over the years, but that's kind of how it started. So I started in computer aided design. But one thing I noticed about myself, probably a lot like you, because you and I have a lot of conversations about this, is a lot of mine was self-taught, and it was driven by my main motivation a lot of times in that is that I noticed that I knew something people didn't, and that was really rare. I was so used to not knowing a lot of things, because of my background. And then I finally had found something where I knew something other people didn't, and people who sought me out to understand things. And that was a huge, motivation for me. But anyways, computer aided design was the way I started as well. And that was kind of the beginning stages, really automations for a lot of things in computers. So that was my original background.
Yeah, we have a pretty similar entry point. So from computer aided design, where did you go? What was your first job at that? How did you get your foot into IT?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It started, like you said, with computer aided design, and I really held on to that for a long time. It was my bread and butter. It really took me out of, I wouldn't say poverty, but it did take me out of, getting above the living check to check level to where I could at least have some fun. And so it was hard to let go. I was transitioning into a different career, but I did see that I had a natural gift more in the technology side than I did. To be honest, I was a horrible structural detailer. Who knows, high school dropout, not math background, doing structural detail. But I wasn't dumb. I just, kind of screwed up a lot. And so when I met you, I'd left TriSteel, as you know. And I guess my first transition period was I was still kind of hanging on to the CAD deal, and I was working independently out of necessity, not because I wanted to. And I had a customer, and it was MFS, which was a fiber company, and there was another company called TCG, Teleport Communications Group, in downtown Dallas. And long story short is I was doing fiber routes for them and things like that in a CAD way. And I was down there and somebody talked to me about this opening they had, and they needed somebody who was technical like myself that kind of could do the CAD thing. And so they hired me, and that was the first job. And I just happened to get at the very opening stage of what they call the CLEC days. And for people who don't know what that is, it's when telecommunication became more diversified from the regional bell companies. And I was right there in the beginning of it. And I worked there, and I eventually, the way I always describe it is it's kind of visual for me. I would hold on to the CAD thing with one hand because it was my bread and butter, afraid to let go, and then the IT thing. And I finally took a risk and just let go. I let go of CAD completely in that role. And that's how I got into IT. Yeah. So it paid, paid a lot. And it was like a kid in a candy store. My beginning days was in a warehouse, not in technology at all. And that company they had now what I know to be today is a Trash 80. Mm-hmm. And they had some computers and fax machines, because fax machines, believe it or not, were just coming on the scene, for small businesses and everything. And I just noticed I had a need for that. It was like a driving need to really want to know, a thirst for knowledge. And so that took me into the communication job I just told you. And that was like a kid in a candy store. I had all, and they empowered me. These people empowered me, and they didn't know a lot even in telecommunication. And I had this huge network and these Cisco routers and, and old technology, new technology, and things like that. So I was very motivated to want to learn. And a lot of it was self-taught. I didn't even have a certs back then. I didn't have a degree. I was really working from a deficit.
Well, that's a great story. And that's one of the things I like to have these different stories is not everyone gets in with a degree. When I got into IT, I didn't have a degree either, and eventually got one later on, but you see a lot of people that don't have them. So if you want a degree, get it. I encourage you if that's something you want to do, but you don't necessarily have to have it. And so that's a good story that you're sharing. So when you got started into security, how did that come about?
Yeah, I same situation. Just if I use that same visual, holding on to two vines, IT paid, changed my life, and I rode the whole .com, first browser wars, all that kind of stuff. Even really some of the, not to date myself, but even some of the evolutions of browsers and internet in general and CompuServe and, all those things. And at the end of it, I'd ridden that wave, so to speak, for a long time. And I was still holding on to it, afraid to let go. But I saw that things were getting kind of commoditized with salaries and stuff and, and fixed cost. And I was the CIO at that time, working at a transportation company. So I'd already, I'd been exposed to security, and I had a lot of the attributes that you need that are really the important thing. If you don't mind, I'll highlight a couple of those things, because this is for people trying to get into security. And I think a lot of times we talk about our histories, but we don't talk about the methods. And one of the methods I had learned that I think is really relevant is that I had learned how to teach myself. And at that time, you couldn't really Google a lot of things. I know that sounds silly, but there was other different dominant browsers, Alta Vista and stuff like that. And even Microsoft, if you didn't pay a subscription, you didn't get the knowledge. Yeah. So a lot of the self-taught was centered around me trying things, not necessarily, I wouldn't call it hacking, but I was trying different things and using behavioral things to kind of go, oh, wow, that's how that works. And I would do a lot of that. So I had that when I was at Andrews, and I was the CIO at a small company. It's really an overglorified title, but I was there, but I was just real unhappy. And the whole time throughout that whole course, for me personally, I had a thirst for knowledge. So I was always trying to deal with my past, Mm-hmm. So I was going to school, even though I was successful. And I got real interested in security. as a formal practice, and I didn't know how I was going to transition, but I knew how to do it. And that goes back to some of the skill sets. Is I knew, because of being in .com and stuff, networking was a big part of it. I knew that. And so I kind of looked through my people I knew, and that's kind of where you came into play.
Yeah.
Some of it was selfishly motivated, what you could do for me, but some of it was natural. We already had a relationship,
And it was networking.
Exactly. And it was easy for me. And I trusted you, and I knew you had my best interest in mind. So I would say, if you don't have that, if you're trying to get into cybersecurity, you're really doing yourself a disadvantage. Find somebody. So a lot of people like Phil, even Phil himself, even me now, and that are willing to help you, because we pay it forward. So I met you as real deal, and I was trying to figure out how to transition, and I'll stop right there and let you do it. But that's how it worked.
Yeah.
You asked me how I got in. I guess the primary principle that really drove me is when I started my master's degree program, at that time and things like that in cybersecurity, not because I knew it was going to get me in. Mm-hmm. It was just, again, wanting to repair my history and things like that. And also I wanted to take something I was, that would add value to me, because I knew a lot of the technology side. But I'd started in my current role, and I call it, and I borrowed it from other philosophies, but act as if, become as if. So even though I wasn't in the role, I started pretending I was in the role. I started thinking that way and trying to think security, and realized that I already had a lot of it, a lot of the attributes already there. So when I started talking to you, it allowed me to be honest and learn from you, because you were ahead of me. You'd already pioneered the path, and you'd been in and stuff. And you were a key component in that. I worked, I think, 2 jobs before I actually got in. Southwest Airlines. I did the City of Dallas's network, for Love Field Modernization Project. I was involved with a lot of security things there, but it wasn't really my primary role. So that's kind of how I did it. I transitioned my way in that way. And a lot of it's just really kind of understanding, getting acclimated to the dialogue and stuff, and kind of understanding things.
One of the things there too, for, since I know Darin and people don't know his background, but we worked together for a while at a large U.S. bank, because Darin had been talking about, I'd seen some of the things he was doing in his day job, doing more blue team stuff. And the way you were assessing security, I saw how that IT sysadmin network administrator background, would make you a good pen tester. Just seeing the way you were doing stuff, I thought you'd be a good fit, because I told Darin at one time, I said, if you can get your OSCP, I could probably get you in where I'm at. And then one of the guys that was on the team with us came from like an IT background, and he was a good pen tester. And I thought, Darin would be a great fit for this. And so that's where I saw that talent. I pride myself on having a talent for finding people that have the skills to be pen testers. And Darin was one of those, and he come in and he's really done a great job, keeps advancing. So one of the things to share with people out there, this is where if you have that IT background, that's where it's helpful. And one of the things I've kind of learned from you, and I share this with a lot of people, is Darin reads the manuals. So if he's doing a pen test and he finds something he hasn't worked with, he'll go through and read the manuals and figure it out. While a lot of pen testers will go in there and just try to find an exploit, hack into it, Darin reads the manuals and figures out in depth and thoroughly assesses the security. Can you kind of explain that to us a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great one. I kind of am calculated about what I do. And sometimes I don't know what it is for myself. I know characteristics about it. And that even goes to breaking into things, pen testing. So sometimes I had to uncover things, for myself. And that's just part of the learning process for me. I had to understand it. And when I was trying to get into security, my first official role I got into was the county, and then I met Aaron, a real good friend of mine then, and of course I went to several roles, and I accelerated very fast through the blue team roles because of my background. But when it comes to pen testing, I try to get into the mindset of whatever first of all, I try to think about, what is what would be the goal, if you were an attacker? And then I think about it from a blue team perspective. What are the most covenant things you're trying to block? And then I start thinking about the people involved in the software. And I look at things, and if I'm not familiar with the software, then I pull down the manual and read it. I may not read the whole thing, but enough to get a flavor of what's going on. And I usually always try to build context with something I know. Sometimes it's accurate, but even building context with something that is not directly related is very valuable, because it's a good way to remember things, because you're kind of anchored to something, And so I'll do that. And I've found some really strange things doing that. Like, mind if I give you one example? Because Phil and I talk back all the time about techniques and things and just weird stuff. And one of the ones I like to bring up is kind of this app, is creating these clear text passwords that are in these weird files that probably very few people knew about. Matter of fact, if you Google it, and I did, I'm trying to remember what they are called, but I'm going to skip over it because it's not really relevant. But if you Googled it, you'd get two different definitions. But because I had read that, I wanted a tool that would look inside the file because I was curious. And I ended up finding, I wouldn't say it was a vulnerability that I found, because the vendor, I later on found the vendor had recommended an upgrade, and they had it kind of as a blurb. They didn't even have it as a vulnerability, but exactly what it was doing is dumping authenticated clear text passwords in there.
Wow.
And that's actually how I got in, is because of that one little effort. So it's always paid off for me. I've always done that. And I know people say, well, you don't have the time. I think you do. I think you could build it in. Sometimes it requires me to spend extra time that I don't get paid for. But I take that knowledge with me everywhere I go. I've always been that way. I don't think there's any harm with that. It benefits me down the road.
So with all the things you have to learn as a pen tester, how do you keep up with that? Because you can't memorize everything. So how do you maintain it?
Yeah, that's a good one. It makes me laugh. You can't see it right now, but I'm smiling and laughing, because as I get older too, my memory's not as sharp. And I know that sounds like I'm talking like I'm an old man, but it does. I think as your mind gets more cluttered with information, it's like hard drive. You run out of room. I have a lot of resources, and again, it goes back to learning how to learn. If you notice, I talk a lot, so I actually have conversations with myself driving in the car, and I'll rehearse dialogue, because that's how I record things in my mind. But I also write things down, and I don't write everything down, but I keep pretty good notes. And even in the beginning stage, I actually ask you what you use, and I didn't want to hear all the stuff that you read, Pentester. I wanted to hear, how do you solve those problems, and like you're asking me. And so I write a lot of stuff down, and a lot of things I'll anchor the things I already know. And, and sometimes they're not necessarily technical. It'll just be, and I don't keep up. Like if you were asked me on an interview right now, what is the speed you would use for your Nmap scan? I'd say, I don't know. I'll Google it. That one I do know, but I'm being facetious, but you get the idea. I don't memorize everything.
Yeah.
The little switches. I guess half the battle for me, I would say my best advice I could give to somebody is understand, it goes back to reading the manual, understand the framework, kind of a top-down approach, understand, what the app's trying to solve or what it is trying to solve. And then once you kind of got that filled in, then you know what to look for. You obviously, that app does a certain function. So then you kind of know what you're looking for, and it's a big time saver.
That's great. One of the things too, and one of the things I share with people is mentoring. If you can get a mentor, you can learn quicker. And so I've been mentoring Darin over the years, but I just hadn't spoon-fed Darin. So I would give him leads and let him figure out for himself. And he's figured out a lot. I learned a lot from Darin as well, because he's got into doing a lot of cloud pen testing, over the past year. So I learned a lot from there. So the mentoring, can really help people get up to speed quicker. Yeah,
that's a good point. I was thinking about that on my ride over here, because I was my focus was, what could I share with my experience, my strength, what hopes could I give people? And, because I'm real interested in doing that, because you freely did it for me. Dallas Hacker Association, a lot of the local communities, Pone School, the one you started, a lot of those people freely gave to me. So, and that fits right into my philosophy anyway. So but the one thing people fail to realize, I think the mentoree gets something out of it, but I think the mentor gets more out of it. I think
I agree.
Sharing with another human being locks it in my memory. When you teach somebody, because I mentor people today, and that's one of my primary motivations. I'll be teaching Dallas College coming up here pretty soon, a pen testing course, which is something you pioneered the way for. So a lot of those, but the relationship becomes more symbiotic. It's a give and take. And at the beginning stages, you may be the taker, but after a while, it becomes bidirectional. And I even have friends that I do that today. I've got a pen test I'm doing right now. I'll end up mentoring the guy, but I wouldn't, even the guy even though he's never pen test, I would not say I'm up here and he's down here. He's a smart guy. He's a free thinker. I usually gravitate to people like that allow you room to think and are not offended for you using your own brain.
Yeah, those are good points. And as you network with people, mentor people, you're building up more resources that you can learn from. It's almost like you've got, other people doing searches for you because they find cool tools and share those with you. Just like we've got a good friend, Mark Moe, that is always doing research on tools. And so we find out a lot of information from him, and Darin and him share a lot. And, I get the benefit of seeing the research they do. So having those connections, mentoring people, the network all pays off.
Yeah, I kind of say leave no good I did behind. It's like putting a cake in the oven. You can sample it before it comes out, but you want to, before you cut bait and throw it in the trash and say it's no good, you always want to work those ideas. I guess that comes a lot from my IT background, because you'd be really surprised. Like, I'll give you another example of that is, and it really goes back to what a pen tester really is thinking outside the box, or taking software and abusing it for something it isn't. That would be more of a live off the land type technique and stuff, which I happen to love. I like stuff like that. I had this problem I was trying to solve, and I think I probably killed you for 10 days every time we got around, just constantly asking you how to solve this problem. I wanted something that looked inside the files, not just found the files for me, but looked inside of them. And I know the people listening probably are wanting to yell off a ton of tools right now, but I was Googling and I just couldn't find one that fit the bill. And I'm not going to mention a tool today because of the branding issue, but I use an unorthodox tool for that, and it works for me. And I think I would say, if you're new, I think everybody has something to offer. If I had said that in a group of elite people, they may have most of them would say it's unusual, but then when they see the results, would have came around. And that's what's really good is no matter where you're coming from, you got to realize that you have value. Your mind is, having that mindset is helpful, and not being afraid to question conventional wisdom. Hell, that's what the vulnerabilities are all about in the first place, right? Yep. Microsoft puts out a product and people question the marketing, or another vendor questioning the marketing of the security of that product, and they're willing to challenge it. And it's the same thing. And that's when I'll give you a compliment back the other way, because it's good to listen to, but it's also the truth, is that's what makes you such a great mentor, is you're not easily offended by that. You're not that challenge coming back the other way doesn't intimidate you at all. You allow it because your value. And I think it has, I know this sounds philosophical, but I think it has a lot to do with what we talked about. because we're self-taught, we both were in that struggle to want to try to be somebody, whatever the hell that means, but to get out of our area, that drove us. Yeah. And we built up this level of confidence in ourselves. I still get imposter syndrome. I know you do too as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's just interesting too, to think back, because, hearing some of your discussion, people really know that you have to be really an analytical thinker to be a pen tester or a hacker or whatever type of offensive security. And a lot of roles in IT and security require some creativity, but don't you agree that having a creative mind is helpful?
Oh, most certainly. Yeah. And I mean, there's a way to challenge conventional wisdom without being offensive. And I'll give you an example. I was, as Phillip said, I've left some of this out. So, but to keep us all moving forward, I'll just work it into a conversation. When I work at a bank, Phillip knows that, and that was my first pen testing job. And keep in mind, I'm coming in new, I have a lot of experience in technology, but never been a pen tester, right? And, coming in an interview with 12 people on the phone, it's a little intimidating. And during the interview process, or during the shadowing, they call it shadowing of a pen test, I felt confident that I was correct about a certain vulnerability with an app, but I had to do it in a way that, I had to kind of dance around the personality of the person I was with. So the way I handled it is I said, well, can we agree to disagree? And will you allow me when it's an appropriate time for me to convince you that I'm correct? And he said, sure. And I ended up doing that. I ended up convincing him I was correct. I think he ended up exploiting it. It's now something that we exploit today, that they're constantly fixing. So, but had I been so, intimidated by and not used my free thinking and my creativity, I would have just kept my mouth shut. So, but I think there's a way to do it. And I think that's important. I think it's important for people to know that, because there is a time to shut up and listen, but there is a time to use active thinking.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another thing, although you're not new to the industry, but just to show people that no matter what level of your career, you can offer something that not everyone knows everything. And it was good that you let them know what you found. I mean, otherwise, if you would have just ignored that and went on, this thing would have remained vulnerable in your environment. And, we mentioned that creative thinking is helpful, analytical thinking is helpful. So in that same spirit, what are your recommendations for someone that wants to become a pen tester?
Well, mine are a little esoteric, some of the things I've said, like think as if, becometh this. I'd say, sit down and pretend you already are. Start where you're at. You don't have to be in the role to be a security person. It's really a mindset. Start with your own stuff. Are you using the same password on every side? It's kind of hypocritical to talk about and you're not doing it, and I constantly do that to myself, even on my pen test, because the hunter can become the hunted, and I don't want to be the cause of a company, because I do pen tests on the side as well. And I don't want to be responsible for that, so you can start where you're at, and I understand people were saying, some people that maybe are new, especially if you're transitioning, say, from a retail market with no experience at all. You got to keep in mind, that's where I came from. It's the same principle. The principles are one and the same. That ability to absorb information. And I'll tell you one thing, and it's right along your question line. A guy told me this a long time ago when I was just basically trying to tell time, learn how to read better. I mean, that sounds silly, but that's where I came from. And I was a grown adult. He said, whenever I got around somebody that had knowledge, he said, Guy, you're definitely behind, no doubt. And he said, whenever you get around anybody that has any bit of knowledge, he said, you absorb them like a sponge. And I've always remembered that. And so, I do that. I listen. I'm active talker. I repeat back what they said to me. So I think dialogue, learning about yourself helps, and not being afraid to take risk. Remember I said, hold on to one vine and let go on the other. it's all about risk. Hell, security is about risk, right? It's about taking risk and what are acceptable risks. And the world of security is massive and it's worth the risk. It's worth taking a risk. Don't be afraid to fail. I've failed many times. I can tell you how many times I get off the phone and go on my first few interviews trying to get in, even knowing things and going, my God, that was terrible. So you just got to not worry about it, because people like yourself, the companies you want to work for are the companies that won't judge you too harshly for that. They'll admire the fact that you're trying, because it's constant learning. I mean, I think I come to you sometimes, and not to put you on the fence, but I come to you with technical things and I'll say, man, you ever heard that before? And it's not that you forgot it, but you'll go, actually, I know.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by that, is that we're all learning. Mm-hmm. Some of us are a little further down the road. So even if you're beginning, re-examining new things, even topics that you think that, oh God, I would never talk to anybody about that. Everybody's heard that. That's not true. There are different attributes. Some of us forget. It's good to hear it again as a refresher. So that's what I would advise you, is don't be intimidated by it. Absorb as much as you can. Start with the basics. I would say I'm like you, Phil. I agree 100%. So I think you need to have some basic understanding of networking if you're going to do pen testing. I think you definitely need to have a good idea of security.
Great advice. So we're getting down towards the end of the show, and if there's anything that we missed, is there anything you'd like to share with the audience, or any shout outs or anything like that you'd like to give?
What I think I'll do is announce my name again, because for the sake of brevity, I'm Darin Fredde. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not a pen tester that hides my identity, not because I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just, I don't mind if you contact me, if you reach out to me. My contact's there for a reason. I'm all about giving back. I have nothing to gain from it other than what you give me is allowing me to share with you. So I would say that.
And Darin's contact information will be in the show notes. So if you want to reach out to Darin and ask him questions, and one of the things I advise people is, no matter how big or famous or whatever you think some people may be or intimidating, reach out to them. You'd be surprised at how people are willing to help you. So thanks, Darin, for joining us. It was an honor having you on the show.
No, it's my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Hacker Factory podcast with Phillip Wylie. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.